Most people moving from New York to Northern Virginia make the exact same mistake. They assume it's just a cheaper version of the same lifestyle, just with more space. And it's not. And I don't mean that in a subtle way. I mean it's fundamentally different in how your day actually unfolds. I've worked with a lot of buyers relocating from Manhattan, from Brooklyn, Westchester, people who are thoughtful, successful, and very used to navigating complex decisions. And they come down here expecting a fairly clean upgrade. More space, less cost, and a little more breathing room. And sometimes that's exactly what they get. But I have also had more than a few conversations, a few months after closing, where someone says something like this to me: Brian, we love the house, but we didn't fully think through how different life would feel. Not worse necessarily, just different in ways that they did not anticipate. I'm Brian Block. I'm a real estate broker here in Northern Virginia. And before that, I practiced law, so I tend to look at decisions not just in terms of the obvious upside, but also the second order effects that show up later. What I want to do in this video is walk you through what actually changes when you move from New York to Northern Virginia. Not just the numbers, but the lived experience. Because that's ultimately what determines whether this move feels like an upgrade or something that you have to adjust to. When people tell me that they're thinking about leaving New York, it's almost never just one reason. It's usually a convergence of pressures that have been building up for a while. There's the obvious one, which is cost. At a certain point, even people doing very well financially start to feel a kind of fatigue around what they're paying relative to what they're getting in New York, especially when you're talking about $4,000, $5,000, sometimes $7,000 a month for a space that can still feel constrained. But cost alone doesn't usually drive the decision. It's what cost represents. It represents trade-offs in space, in comfort, in flexibility. Then there's the question of space itself. Maybe it's a second bedroom. Maybe it's a real home office. Maybe it's simply the ability to not feel like every square foot has to be optimized. And then there's the pace of life. New York has an incredible energy. It's part of what makes it so compelling for people to live there. But that intensity can start to feel less like excitement and more like background noise over time. And then, increasingly, there's flexibility. A lot of people that I work with no longer need to be in Manhattan 5 days a week, which opens up a completely different set of possibilities. But here's where the decision starts to go off track for some people. They think they're making a housing upgrade, when in reality, they're attempting to redesign the structure of their daily life. And those are very different decisions. I worked with a couple from Manhattan, both in demanding careers. And when they first reached out, they said something very straightforward to me. We just want more space, which makes perfect sense. But as we talked more, it became clear that what they were really after wasn't just square footage. They wanted quieter mornings, a sense of routine that felt less compressed, and a little more control over how their day unfolded. That's not just a real estate decision. That is a lifestyle shift. And Northern Virginia can absolutely deliver that. But only if you're intentional about what you're choosing. Let's talk about costs. But let's talk about it honestly, not just in headline comparisons. Because this is one of those areas where the surface level analysis can be misleading. On a pure price per square foot basis, there's no question that Northern Virginia is more accessible than Manhattan and many of the surrounding areas. You might be looking at $1,200 to $1,800 per square foot in parts of New York versus something closer to $300 to $500 per square foot in Northern Virginia, depending on which area. That's a real significant difference, and it translates into dramatically more space. A home in the $800,000 to $1.2 million range here might get you 2,500 to 4,000 square feet, multiple bedrooms, outdoor space, and possibly a garage. And for many people, that feels like a major upgrade. But this is where I always slow the conversation down, because you're not just buying more space, you're stepping into a different financial model. In Northern Virginia, most households are car dependent. So now you're factoring in 1 or 2 vehicles, insurance, gas, maintenance. Property taxes here are generally around 1% of assessed value annually, depending on the county. Fairfax, Arlington, Alexandria, each has its nuances. So on a $900,000 home, you might be looking at roughly $9,000 a year in property taxes. Utilities are higher because the homes are larger. And then there's maintenance, which is something many New York buyers haven't had to think about in the same way. Roofs, HVAC systems, landscaping. These are now your responsibility. I had a client who told me early on, this feels like such a financial upgrade. And in some ways, it was. But after about 6 months, they said something a little bit more nuanced. We didn't save as much as we expected, but we got a different kind of value. And I think that's exactly right. You're not necessarily reducing your cost of living dramatically. You're reallocating it into space, comfort, and control. Now let's talk about lifestyle. This is the part that really determines whether the move from New York City to Northern Virginia works for you. Because the biggest change isn't financial, it's experiential. In New York, your life is largely built around proximity. You step outside and the city presents you with options, restaurants, people, energy, movement. There's a kind of frictionless spontaneity to it. Northern Virginia operates differently. Your life becomes more structured, more intentional, and often more private. Instead of walking downstairs and deciding where to go, you're often getting in the car and heading somewhere specific. Whether that's dinner in Old Town Alexandria, coffee in Clarendon, or meeting friends in Tysons, there's usually a decision and a drive involved. And that doesn't sound like a big deal on paper, but it changes how your days feel. I had a client who moved into a beautiful home in Fairfax County, exactly what they thought they wanted. And after a few months, they said something that stuck with me. We didn't realize how much we relied on just stepping outside and having life happen all around us. That's a real adjustment, because in New York, especially in the city, life comes to you. In Northern Virginia, you create your life more deliberately. Now, for a lot of people, that is a huge positive. There's more calm, more predictability, more space to think. But if you thrive on constant stimulation and density, that shift can feel noticeable. Let's talk about commuting. The next piece that tends to surprise people is how geography works here. Because Northern Virginia looks fairly compact on the map, but it does not function that way in practice. Let me give you a very common example. Somebody will say, this home is only 10 miles from DC, and that sounds close. But depending on the route and the time of the day, that 10 miles can easily translate into a 40 to 60 minute commute. And that is not an outlier. That's normal. So when you're evaluating location, you have to think in terms of live time and not just the distance. What does your commute actually feel like at 8 o'clock in the morning? What does it feel like coming home at 5:30 or 6 p.m.? The metro system here is helpful, especially along the Orange and Silver lines through Arlington into Tysons, but it's not the same as New York City. You're not dealing with trains every few minutes on every single corner. There's more planning involved, and sometimes it may involve a drive to the station before the train ride even begins. This is one of those areas where getting it wrong has a daily impact, because you feel your commute every single day. For more information about commuting, please make sure to watch my video about Northern Virginia commuting on this channel. Now, let's talk about Northern Virginia itself. This is not one uniform area. It's a collection of very distinct environments, each with its own character. Arlington, for example, is probably the closest thing to a New York-adjacent lifestyle. Areas like Clarendon, Ballston, and Roslyn offer walkability, density, and proximity to DC that feels somewhat familiar, though still quieter than Manhattan. Alexandria, especially Old Town, has a completely different feel. Cobblestone streets, historic homes, waterfront views along the Potomac, charming, slower, and very community-oriented. Then you move into areas like McLean and Great Falls, where you're looking at much larger homes, more privacy, and a quieter, more insulated lifestyle. And then Fairfax, Burke, and Springfield, more suburban environments, often with strong schools, parks, and a family-oriented rhythm. This is where I always pause clients and say, don't fall in love with a house before you understand the area, because the area determines your daily experience. I've had clients walk into a home and immediately want to write an offer. And then we step back and walk through what their week would actually look like living there. Where do you go for coffee? Where do you meet people? How often are you driving? What does your social life look like? And sometimes this exercise completely changes the decision. You can get a feel for the different areas by watching my video about the 7 best places to live in Northern Virginia. There's also a cultural layer here that's worth understanding. Northern Virginia is one of the most highly educated, professionally driven regions in the country. You have a strong presence of government, consulting, tech, legal and policy work, and the military. There's ambition here, but it expresses itself differently than it does in New York. In New York, ambition is visible, fast-moving, and often outward. Here, it's more measured, more structured, more long-term oriented. People are focused on careers, families, stability, community. Social interactions tend to be a little more intentional. You're more likely to plan a dinner than to stumble into one. And over time, that creates a different kind of rhythm. To get a real sense of life in Northern Virginia, check out my video on pros and cons of moving to Northern Virginia. So who thrives in Northern Virginia? People who are looking for more space, more control over their environment, and a balance between work and personal life. And who tends to struggle? People who rely heavily on spontaneity, dislike driving, and want constant access to activity. So, is moving from New York to Northern Virginia a good idea? It can be an incredible move, one that improves your quality of life in very real ways. But it's not automatic. The difference comes down to whether your expectations match what the day-to-day experience actually feels like. And before you make that decision, there's one more piece you really need to understand, which is whether Northern Virginia is actually worth the cost overall once you factor everything in. Because that's where people either feel confident in their move or they start second guessing it. Even if you're still early in the decision-making process about moving to the Northern Virginia area, I'm always happy to have these conversations. Understanding the vibe, the costs, the commute, and the culture of Northern Virginia is very helpful in helping you feel comfortable with your decision.